Okay, turn your Bible to Exodus chapter 40, verse 35, and we're going to read up to Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of the congregation because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, Amen. Okay. So before we move on, it's been over a month since we heard the last sermon, and what that means is we have to kind of review because most of you probably forgot about what the sermons were even on. We were actually taking our time through the Ten Commandments, and we finished the Ten Commandments before the quarantines began, and now we're moving from the end of Exodus into the beginning of Leviticus. Leviticus is one of those books where it's very, very important that all Christians read it, but most Christians will skip it because it doesn't have a story or it doesn't have, what people would consider excitement. It's a set of laws that God gives towards the Levites, but it's actually very, very important for Christians to read it. Leviticus is about identity. It's about what it means to be not only a priest of God, but the high priest of God, or to belong within the priesthood family of God. So in Leviticus, there's lots of topics that are discussed. Things like worship, like food and dietary laws based on what's considered clean and unclean, disease laws. Like we talk about, the news is talking about quarantining people because there's like a disease outbreak. The Bible actually talks about quarantines and the proper way to quarantine even before like all this stuff was around. So we really need to dig deep into Leviticus because it talks about identity, what it means to be holy before God, and what that means concerning our identity. Now, when we talk about identity, we're not just talking about identity by choice or a libertarian notion of identity where people choose what their identity is. We're talking about identity that God has given since creation. So when we talk about being holy, or when we talk about being part of the family of priesthood, we're talking about Hyodo. We've talked about what Hyodo was, right? Honoring your mother and your father. But the priesthood class goes beyond just honoring God. They're used by God to basically teach his people his word, like many stuff that we can go into later. And the problem that we have is we're trying to finish the entire Bible within 5 years. So even though I feel that we need to go deeply into Leviticus, we can't go as deep as I would like. So we have to sort of do a balanced, like specific things, but at the same time we have to go cover as much as we can in Leviticus because that way the rest of the Bible will kind of make sense. And what I mean by that is if you were to say, what's the central, like what books are central to the Old Testament part of the Bible? My answer would be, not only my answer, but like the general consensus of pastors and theologians would be the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses determine sort of like how we're supposed to view the rest of the Old Testament Bible, through what lens we're supposed to see that. So then the question is, okay, out of the 5 books of Moses, then which is the most important not important, but which one is like the focal point? And that would be Leviticus. Leviticus tells us how we're supposed to view Exodus, Genesis, and then Numbers and Deuteronomy. It's through the lens of Leviticus we see what holiness means. Then we understand why God created the way things, why God created everything the way He did, why He created it, how He created it. We see all the holiness in His work, and then why sin is such a problem for us. All these comes from the book of Leviticus. So if we get to Leviticus, if we kind of understand what Leviticus is about, then we can have a good grasp of what the 5 books of Moses is about, which then lets us have a good grasp of what the Old Testament as a whole is about. So if you read Leviticus 1:1, it's a continuation from the previous book, which is from the book of Exodus. So it's like there's the end of Exodus and it leads into Leviticus 1:1, which is why Leviticus 1:1 begins with the word and. So it's like here's the end of Exodus, and then beginning of Leviticus is a continuation of the end of Exodus. So because it's been such a long time since we last heard the normal sermon series, we have to kind of review what we were talking about. So we finished the Ten Commandments, and if you remember, God brought the Israelites out of Egypt in order that they might worship God. And it was supposed to be a 3 days journey out of Egypt. You guys remember that? It was supposed to be a 3 days journey out of Egypt, but it ended up being a 3 months travel from Egypt. And they finally come to Mount Sinai. And all this time, of course, if you guys remember, God trained them to consider the holiness of God by feeding them manna for actually 7 days, but for 6 days they were told to gather, or for 5 days they were told to gather 1 day's worth, and then on the 6th day they were told to gather 2 days worth, and then on the 7th day God didn't send any manna because they were supposed to have enough from the previous day, which is the 6th day, to have 2 days worth of manna for their family as a whole. And they weren't supposed to travel outside their camp on the Sabbath day. So all these things God did to train Israel to think about the holiness of God. And instead of taking 3 days, and remember, the Israelites didn't even consider sacrificing to God. So if you remember, like all the way back in the Old Testament, all the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and even up to Joseph, like they were sacrificing to their God regularly. But after their time in Egypt, after having spent over 400 years in Egypt, they sort of forgot about their sacrifices because they didn't consider their holiness to be something to be relatable to God. Like they didn't think about God as being holy because they were so involved in the idols of Egypt. So when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, the first thing that has to happen is the sacrifices, because they have to realize that God is holy, which is why God taught them through the Sabbath about the holiness of God, about what God considers holy, and what things belong to God. So instead of 3 days, they travel for 3 months out of Egypt, and they finally get to Mount Sinai, right? So Israel spent 3 months coming out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, out of the land of death. They come to Mount Sinai, and God commands people to sanctify or make themselves holy, to distance themselves from the mountain because he's going to land there. And it says, wash yourselves. It says, wash your clothes, wash yourself. And he says, prepare to meet the Lord. That concept of like washing yourself to prepare to meet the Lord, that's the concept of what holiness relates to. It's this idea that you're going to be in God's presence, so you have to be clean. You have to be holy as well because God is holy. So Moses tells God that because he commanded them not to come near the mountain, they can't come to God to receive his commandments. So God commands Moses to come up with Aaron only. So then God gives the 10 Commandments. The people at the bottom of the mountain only see the mountain smoking because of the presence of God, with a thick darkness covering it, and lightning and sounds of thunder and trumpet coming out of the darkness. And I mentioned this before, but some people who write praise music, they don't really read the Bible. They just sort of write out of their emotion. So they say, or they have like lyrics that says something like, God covers himself in light and darkness tries to hide. We see in this verse that God uses darkness to cover himself, because if people were to see the full glory of God as sinners, they would die. So, those kinds of people, like, they also need to read the Bible if they're going to write praise music. So the people say to Moses to be their mediator, meaning somebody to go between them and God, to speak to them, to be a middle person between them and God, because they don't want to die due to God's presence. They tell Moses, let God tell you what he says, and then tell us what he says. Through you. Because if they heard God, they would die as sinners. They recognized, they understood the holiness of God by this time. So Moses calms the people down, and he listens to more of God's commandments. Apart from the 10 Commandments, there's more commandments, which is a more deeper and clearer commandments that relate to the 10 Commandments given earlier. Then God tells Moses, such as we'll get to that later. So God tells Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, the 70 elders of Israel, and they worship God from far off, and then God tells Moses only to come closer to God. So you can see that there's 3 levels here. Where the people are, then there's where the group that Moses went with, Aaron, they're closer to God than the people of Israel, which are at the bottom of the mountain. And that group received the 10 Commandments, and then even closer to God, where only one person Moses was allowed to go to. So there's 3 levels here. There's the person Moses that went closest to God, and then there's the group of people and then there's the rest of Israel at the bottom of the mountain. So after God tells Moses to come closer, Moses and Aaron goes back to Israel to pick up the 70 elders and Nadab and Abihu, and tells Israel what he heard from God, and writes a book with all of God's commandments in it so far. And then in Exodus chapter 24:3, this is what happens. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do." Okay. Moving further on, Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offering and oxen to the Lord. So they're finally sacrificing to the Lord now. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basin, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. He took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." Then Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." So there's a book that Moses writes that contains God's commandments. Right? He comes down from the mountain with the elders. There's a book that Moses writes that contains God's commandments. The Israelites make a covenant with God. They bind themselves to God. That's what a covenant means. It means a binding. By a ritual of making an altar at the foot of the mountain, at the bottom of the mountain, 12 stones, piled pillars to represent Israel, and then sacrificing oxes for burnt offering and peace offering for their sins. Moses takes the blood of the oxes and used half of it to cover the altar that the young men of Israel used to burn their ox offerings on. Then he takes the other half of the blood and sprinkles the blood on the people of Israel. So Israel hears Moses repeat God's commandment, then they'll obey. Moses writes a book with all the commandments so far, and then Israel offer burnt sacrifices and peace offerings with oxes, and Moses uses the blood of the oxes to cover the altar used for offerings, and then to sprinkle the people with the blood, and say, "Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." So this is what happened so far. God bound himself to them by his blood covenant with Abraham back in Genesis, if you remember. Israel now bound themselves to God with this blood covenant. So here you can say there's blood between God and his people. In the Bible, blood can mean either life or death. So when the Jews forced the Romans to crucify Jesus, they say, "Let his blood be upon our heads and their children's," meaning, let his death be upon them and their children. But in other parts of the Bible, like Leviticus or Acts, the Bible talks about the life-giving blood, or the blood that is the life. So in God's covenant with his people, there's life and death between him and his people. There's blood between him and his people. There's life for covenant keepers, and there's death for covenant breakers. The fact that Abraham had to kill pigeons, and now Israel had to kill oxen to offer them as a burnt offering and peace offering towards God, means that God is willing to bind himself to his people, make a covenant with them despite their sins, by temporarily passing over their sins to the animals that died. And if you remember, this is what happened during the Passover. God commanded the Israelites to kill a firstborn male lamb in a certain way, and then after you kill it, they're supposed to cook the meat, but then take the blood of the lamb and then apply it to the post of the door, the top and the sides, and then whoever remained inside the house with the door that had the applied blood, they would live. So a similar thing is going on here, where God is willing to despite the sins of his people, God is willing to temporarily pass over their sins, so that he can bind himself to them. So why is God willing to make a covenant with sinful people despite their sins? It's because God made a covenant with Adam and Eve all the way back in Genesis 3:15 to redeem sinful men from their sin by the seed of the woman. So God passed on Adam and Eve's sin by putting their guilt of sin on the killed animal, and then took that animal skin and put it on Adam and Eve to wear. God made a covenant with Abraham and his seed, covering the sins of Abraham using the pigeons. Then here the Israel now make a covenant with God, but only with their sins covered by the oxes they offered as burnt offering, because God would temporarily pass over their sins. So without the shedding of blood, and God's people could not be with God because of God's wrath. So death would be rewarded to those sinners without this shedding of blood. So there's blood between God and his people, in both senses, the good and the bad. So God is willing to temporarily pass over the sins of his people by putting the guilt of sin on the animal that are killed instead. So after this happens, Moses goes back up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu and the 70 elders to the second section where they were before, away from Israel but not close to God. But they saw God there in the second person of God the Son as some kind of figure and saw his foot in that figure. So Moses told them to stay there, stay where they are, and Moses moves closer to God in the mount where the darkness was covering it. So Israel is outside the mountain. Aaron and the elders are in the middle, somewhere in the foot of the mountain, but not with Moses. And then Moses went into the mountain where God was covering his presence by a cloud. And Moses stays there for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving the following commandments of God. Number 1, how to build the Ark of the Covenant. Number 2, how to build the tabernacle tent. Number 3, how to make the clothes that Aaron the high priest and his sons would wear in the tabernacle. Number 4, how to offer the atonement sacrifice as high priest once every year. Number 5, a reminder to keep the Sabbath day by giving Moses 2 stone tablets with God's 10 commandments written on them, which he promised earlier in Exodus chapter 24, verse 12. And there's some more, but we'll get to those later. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13, it reads, "And he declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even the 10 commandments. And he wrote them upon 2 tablets of stones." So that's what's being referred to here in Exodus. That'll later appear in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13. So while Moses is up here, it's taking too long. People come to Aaron at the foot of the mountain and convince him to make a golden calf as their god. Moses is coming. The golden calf god, that's a small case G, not capital G. So Moses coming back down, he sees Joshua first, then he hears the noise of the idol worshiping, and then when he sees Israel worshiping the idol, he throws down God's tablets in anger and tells Israel to move away from the idol and kill all those that are worshiping the idol. And the only people that listen to Moses are the Levites, the sons of Levi. So because the Levites are the only people that display God's wrath, God causes the Levites to be his priests forever. And Moses begs God to forgive their sin, which God does, and commands Moses to follow his angel. So God sends an angel, and Moses follows him, and the angel sends Israel away from the mountain because God's anger would kill them. Right? So they're at the foot of the mountain, and they just committed one of the most heinous sins against God, which is idol worshiping, like right at the foot of the mountain where God's presence, the mountain of which God's presence has landed. Like it's there right now. So in order for them not to die, in order for God's wrath not to break out and like kill them, they need to get away. So the angel leads them away from the mountain of God. And remember, God bound himself to Israel. So he doesn't want to kill Israel. But the Israelites, because they rebelled, that's the reason why they're in danger right now. So Moses goes back to the mountain for another 40 days and 40 nights. He receives another set of 2 stone tablets as God reaffirmed and reminds Israel through Moses to keep his Sabbath holy and to not worship other gods, to not worship idols. God shows his back at this time to Moses, and at the same time God covers Moses' face so that Moses doesn't die. And when Moses went back to the Israel camp, they couldn't look at Moses' face because they were afraid, because the residue of God's glory was on Moses' face. So they had to cover it with a veil. And then as God commanded them through Moses, they built the ark, they built the tabernacle, the things inside the tabernacle required for sacrifice. They made Aaron's clothes and all the things that God commanded that they need to make for service in God's tabernacle. And then Leviticus begins as God continues to give a clearer and more deeper understanding of his commandments and what it means to be holy. And more importantly, God spoke to Israel through Moses in the tabernacle now, not at Mount Sinai. So if you think about what's going on, despite Israel's sin, so God first talked with Israel through Moses, right? So back in Egypt, God spoke to the Israelites through Moses, and then they actually got to meet God, in a sense, to a degree, face to face, because they saw the presence of God on Mount Sinai. But God doesn't stay at Mount Sinai. He brings his presence inside the camp of Israel, and the way he does that is he commands Israel to build this holy structure that he's willing to dwell in. Or not he's willing to dwell, but will keep his name in, keep his presence in. So what ends up happening is, despite Israel's sin, God wants to be with Israel. So instead of staying on the mountain and, telling Israel to come to the mountain only and, he's going to keep his presence only in the mountain, God doesn't do that. He moves with Israel into the presence of Israel, like with the Israel people, with this thing called a tabernacle or a temple, a place where God places His name there. And by the tabernacle, God's presence is now among Israel instead of apart from them. He is now walking among Israel. And that's the point. That's the end of Exodus that leads into Leviticus, is that God is not some God that's like far away, but He wants to be involved among us, like be with us. That's God's determination. But the problem is we're sinners. So if God decides to just come and share His presence, not share His presence, display His presence among us, like we're just gonna die. So what God does is He sets up these restrictions, and He sets up these laws to keep us clean, to purify us, to cleanse us, to make us holy, in order that God can dwell among us. That's how Exodus ends and Leviticus begins. It ends with God's commandment on Mount Sinai, and then Leviticus begins with God speaking to Moses through the tabernacle now, because God's presence now is moving with Israel in the tabernacle. So my prayer is that as we delve more into Leviticus, because remember, Leviticus is one of those books that every Christian should read. They should read it as much as they read the New Testament, because it contains a lot of the truth of God in there, like why God commanded these things to keep His holiness, what it means for us to be holy in God's presence. There's a lot of these things in there that we need to learn as Christians, because we Christians are a priesthood class according to the Apostle Peter. We're also a nation of royalty. So it's very important for us to know what God means when He says that He is holy. So my prayer is that you guys read Leviticus, you guys keep the 5 basic Christian practices, and as we move forward from here, that you guys keep healthy, and remember to keep honoring your parents, because Leviticus is about Hyodo. It's about our identity in and with God, and how that identity affects the rest of our lives.